A Conjuring development production log week 3. A lot to go through this week, even though it feels to me like I didn't get much done. First up, we've got a GeoNodes flooring idea that I had left over from last week that I forgot to include in the previous production log. The flooring is done entirely in geometry nodes with the exception of the floor texture, which is something from like CC0 textures or something. It can grow as much as needed, which is really nice. I did do this 2 weeks ago, and I'm already seeing a lot of room to improve. Defining a width and a length for the bounding box for it and then Boolean out the remainder would be a really good idea. Get rid of some of that overhang. This could also be reused with some input values to modify board sizes and spacing. There's also some color variation that would be nice per board as well if we were to use like a instance per island or color per island kind of thing. Once we get into the shader nodes, that would help to break it up as well. After that, I did a really quick rigid body physics test, playing basically with rigid body physics. I hadn't worked with them before. The reason that I wanted to do this is because part of this project is going to require stacking firewood, and I have literally zero interest in stacking a bunch of firewood manually. So I put this together just to see how it worked, to get an idea as a proof of concept for how the physics simulations work for rigid bodies. And then, of course, throwing a little bit extra on there, just working those skills, animation, texturing, lighting, all those things. From there, I wanted to see how it would work with actual logs. So I did a basic quarter log, put that into a sim with an invisible bounding box. And this essentially solves the problem for me, which takes me to that next step, which was getting some variation on the log sizes and dumping that in and making sure that that still worked. And it does. If you look at it, it's not great looking, but also like this is going to be a cartoony-ish animation. Those logs are going to be sitting in a corner in a dark room. They don't need to be perfect. Took that, built some firewood holders around them. I had intended to do 2 or 3, but once I'd done 2, that felt really like enough. The first one is a metal, something that you might buy with a little bit of a cast iron feel to it. And then the second one is just like, what if I just had some wood planks and I needed to slap something together? That's what this one is. I wanted to, again, focus on some animation and render settings with each project if possible. So did a really quick animation on this with the motion blur, first time testing out motion blur. There's some wonkiness in the shadows if you watch when an item goes from in motion to stopped. There's this weird kind of glitch on some of the shadows as they settle, which I'm not a super fan of, but that's way beyond what I'm actually trying to test out and learn from here. So I'm not too worried about that. Moved on to doing some book examples. I need a book for this, and I wasn't quite sure the best way to model one. I wasn't sure what the geometry would need to be for that, how you would put that together. So I threw this one together to start with. There are some texturing issues on this, and the mesh is kind of a mess. But like, if you look at it, it's just kind of inoffensive to look at, right? You put that on the turntable, get that little 360. It looks okay. There's nothing great about it, but it definitely is a good start. Took that same book, pulled it into the sculpting tools, mostly just playing around with the tools to see what I could get from them in this context. And as I got some shape out of it, popped into the shader, tried to get something a little organic out of it. The first person I showed this to, what he said was, "You're making an Necronomicon, aren't you?" No, I do eventually want to try that as practice, but for the ultimate goal for this project, a Necronomicon style book is not what I'm looking for. What I'd actually like is like a leather book with stamped and foiled letters. This is a decent proof of concept of that idea. It's something that I touched on before starting this project, so I had a rough idea of how to do this and how to make it work. There's definitely more work on this. I want the book to be distressed both in the cover and the letters themselves, but this is likely the direction that I'll be taking with the film. So we'll have that leather covered book that's got some damage and distressing to it with foiled letters on it. On top of that, I need to be able to open the book. I want my character to be able to reach down, open up that book to a page. So my rigging and animation skills, they're absolutely not something that I've spent any time working on. Everything that I've done so far has been auto-rigged through Mixamo and just moving that character around into a fixed pose. Actual animation isn't something that I've done a lot with armatures and rigs. Put this together pretty quickly. I didn't use the existing mesh that was there. I want to try to create something new, and I think this is a much cleaner mesh if you were to actually look at the mesh. And then once we get in there and start smoothing some of that out with subsurf mods and bevels and stuff, I think it'll end up being a much lighter mesh while providing more functionality to it. This works. I need to still figure out how to get a book block to animate properly along with pages, but this is, again, another decent start based on getting that book stuff done. The next thing that I looked at this week, I've got my character. I want him to have like runes or sigils either painted or tattooed on his body in black. And when he's performing his ritual, I want those to move from black to glowing. This was my first step here, just trying to see if there was an easy way to do this. And so this one's using a color ramp and a noise texture to control changing between a principled shader and an emission shader. It's okay. It's nothing special. I wanted to control that a little more rather than having this whole texture that changes over time. I wanted to try and wipe in and out. So I wanted to use a gradient for that, a gradient texture, which is much easier to control and cleaner than a color ramp anyways. Not really the direction I'm looking for with this, but it does prove out that you can use a gradient to do that. And that's an improvement, definitely not like where I'd like to end up. This one is definitely getting there. I like the textured feeling as it wipes in and out. It feels a little static. It feels like there's something missing from it. So I went out to go and try and find some other ideas on how I could do this. And as I was researching, I found a similar effect from a Ducky 3D tutorial. Followed a similar principle to what they're doing in that tutorial, which I will link in the notes here. And like fundamentally, following that similar principle, I ended up here, and I kind of like how it looks. That Musgrave texture into the noise texture gives it a really interesting look and feel. There's definitely a bunch of work here to do to get this working the way that I want it to. There's some Fresnel stuff around the edges I'd like to look at. There's also a circular gradient wipe instead of a linear one. And I also need to try this against UV, because if these are things painted on my character, what I'm thinking is that I will have a base skin shader for the texture, and then I will have UVs to put over for all of these sigils and runes and stuff. And then all I have to do is change those. So I need to figure out how to do a circular gradient wipe or a radial gradient wipe instead of a linear one, and then do that against something that's been painted on a UV. Still grinding forward, still figuring stuff out. It is definitely getting there.